Hi all! This week we're talking about apologies, forgiveness, and reconciliation. These are three very different things, but they're conceptually related and they often build on each other when we're thinking about a conflict situation. So in this video I'm going to briefly talk about apologies and forgiveness together and then move on to discussing reconciliation. So apologies. We know what apologies are. Apologies are verbal statements that express regret for some action, such as doing something that causes a conflict. Apologies are often the first step toward reconciling a relationship and resolving a conflict. And on the one hand, apologizing is pretty straightforward and we have lots of experience with it. As children, we're told to say you're sorry when we do something wrong, like apologize for hitting your brother, right? And we learn that saying sorry is necessary for good conflict resolution. But on the other hand, most of us are actually pretty bad at apologizing. Sometimes we don't want to apologize. And sometimes even when we do sort of want to apologize, we're not sure how to do it, right? So a lot of apologies are insincere and they can even be hurtful. For example, if a kid is really angry and calls someone a jerk and then that kid is forced to apologize, they might say something like, "I'm sorry you're a jerk," or "sorry I called you a jerk," even though you totally are one, or even just "sorry you didn't like being called a jerk," right? So none of those are actually sincere expressions of regret for some sort of action, right? They're not really apologies. They don't show concern for the other person's emotion and perspective. And yet, sometimes that's what apologies look like, right? So adults are actually pretty bad at apologizing too. Sometimes we don't want to apologize because we think that saying sorry is admitting guilt, admitting that we are to blame, right? And so if we say we're sorry, then that's like opening ourselves up to be blamed and attacked, right? So sometimes we are like not wanting to apologize. And you may have heard even people say things like, "I'm sorry you were offended," which is, again, not really a full apology because it's not really taking ownership for the wrongdoing. It's not really expressing regret. It's not really being oriented toward the other person, right? It's just really just kind of putting blame on the person who's being apologized to, right? So scholars who study conflict make a distinction between interpersonal apologies, like these examples I've been giving, apologies that occur between friends, family members, coworkers, romantic partners, and so on. And so that's different from public apologies, such as statements made by public figures who've been called out for some sort of wrongdoing. The textbook chapter that we're reading this week explains this distinction pretty well and spells out different types of apologies, from like small, almost ritualistic statements like, "Oops, sorry, you go ahead," right? Which is a genuine apology, but like not over some sort of major wrongdoing, just something small. It's just almost like we just say it because it seems like the right thing to say, even though it's not like a really big apology for a really big issue. So from that all the way to like really formal, carefully crafted statements where the person speaking admits wrongdoing, expresses sincere regret, and makes an effort to repair things. There are whole bodies of research looking at public apologies, crisis management, and public relations. And those sorts of public apologies in organizational and political community settings are really important for leaders who need to manage their image, especially if they've committed something wrong, committed a wrongdoing, like ethical violations, lying, sexual harassment, and so on. And so we see these in public life, and there are whole bodies of research that kind of look at what that is about. And I think that is super fascinating and interesting, but it's also a little bit aside from the focus of our class. So the purpose of our class tend to think more about interpersonal apologies and their role in conflict, even if that conflict is happening in an organizational setting. Often when we're thinking about conflict, it is more the sort of social interpersonal interactions, right? So in this context, we often find ourselves trying to assess how real an apology is. Did he really mean it when they said that? How sincere is this apology? As a listener, this is kind of something that we are trying to make sense of. So key aspects we notice are how the personal apologies are communicated, right? Face-to-face, via email, text, chat, whatever. What words they use and what those words mean to us in the context of our relationship. the timing of the apology, and the relationship of the apologizer to the other person. So the context and the relationship, the message, and the channel of apology all make a big difference when we're trying to assess like what's really going on with this apology, right? And apologies, of course, that's a statement, but it should be an invitation for further conversation, right? That it shouldn't just be like, okay, apologize, now it's over. It's this kind of invitation for dialogue, right? So apologies are closely related to our other kind of key term for this week, which is forgiveness. Now, forgiveness, as our textbook defines it, is both an emotional and cognitive internal process by which the offended party or victim works through the hurt and relinquishes grudges and feelings of hatred and animosity or resentment toward the offender. So in forgiveness, the victim forgoes any wishes or plans for retaliation, revenge, or claims for restitution. That's big. That's big stuff, right? So again, when we're kids, we learn that in a conflict, everyone should apologize and everyone should forgive, and then the conflict will be resolved. But of course, that's really oversimplified. True forgiveness is really hard. Apologies are an important step, but they don't automatically lead to forgiveness, right? Sometimes people apologize for wrongdoing, but the victim of their offense, the person who has been wronged, is unable or does not want to forgive, right? Victims are not required to forgive, and forgiveness should never be sort of mandated or, kind of forced. That can just further victimize people who've suffered wrongdoing, right? You can't force someone to forgive or get over it. We have to choose to forgive. It has to be a conscious decision, and it's a process that requires a lot of work. So apologies can prompt forgiveness, but sometimes people who have been victimized or wronged in some way can work through their hurt and come to forgiveness, even if the person who's wronged them does not or maybe cannot apologize. So this kind of deep forgiveness, I think, is really incredible. And but it does happen, and it is sort of, it's a long-term process, but it is something that happens, and it's pretty deep and powerful. And this kind of deep forgiveness is what forms the foundation for reconciliation work. Okay, so that's our third concept for this week, is reconciliation. And reconciliation requires that both parties work through forgiveness in order to acknowledge but let go of the past and focus on new future relationships. Now again, I do not use this term lightly. I don't think that you apologize, you forgive, and then woohoo, reconciliation, woo, that was so cool and easy, right? This is really difficult work, and it takes commitment and deep personal reflection and a strong desire to move forward to a future together on all sides. Everyone involved has to have those things in order for this to really happen. Sometimes people are able to engage in this kind of reconciliation work on their own, right? Especially if they have an otherwise healthy and strong relationship, like maybe romantic partners or spouses who've been married for a long time, and then there's something terribly wrong that happens, but they are able to sort of work through that and reconcile and sort of continue with their relationships. I think even families like parents and kids and stuff like this, adult children who've been wronged, can eventually work toward this sort of reconciliation. That can happen. But often this kind of work requires the help of a third party, somebody to work with the process, like a counselor or a mediator who can help everyone involved be open, honest, compassionate, and forward-looking. So on an interpersonal level, reconciliation with the help of a third party can sometimes happen through like victim-offender reconciliation efforts. That's something that happens sometimes through the court system as a way to make peace, right? Beyond sort of the like jail time and all of that kind of stuff. But a lot of the reconciliation and peace-building work happens in communities, such as post-Civil War societies or communities that have faced long-standing violence and trauma, right? So in our readings and other learning material for this week, we see some examples of people working with groups to help them work toward reconciliation. And this kind of reconciliation, I think it can be hard for us to wrap our head around sometimes, right? Especially if we're not involved in this situation. For example, I had a graduate student who studied restorative justice efforts in post-Civil War society in several different countries. And she described the process through which people came to have deep forgiveness and reconciliation, even with neighbors and other community members who had like killed members of their family, right? So hopefully, so again, we have examples of this in some of our readings and other materials, and it's good food for thought to think about like what makes this sort of forgiveness and reconciliation possible. Now, hopefully none of you will be part of a community facing such violence and pain. Yet, understanding forgiveness and reconciliation on a deep level can help us approach even minor conflicts in more powerfully reflective ways. So I hope you find the readings and other materials meaningful and thought-provoking this week, and that they give you things to think about and consider with your own sort of conflict experiences. Thanks, and let me know what questions you have. I look forward to reading your reflections this week.